You're listening to the Faith and Other Oddities podcast, brought to you by the Raven Creek Social Club, where we talk about faith and other oddities. For questions, comments, or to be part of the conversation, join us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, where you can find us at Raven Creek SC. Now for your hosts, Emily Dixon and Nathan Underwood.
Hey everyone, welcome back to Faith and Other Oddities. We're back for more fun in Judges, right?
Yeah,
Okay.
Judges. I hope so. That's why I've got notes on.
Okay, well, when we last left, God had just consumed a very large meal.
A huge meal.
Although I think he kind of, I don't want to say cheated. I don't want to accuse him of that, because he didn't actually eat it. He just burned it.
Right.
So,
yeah. Well, does God eat? I guess
he did with Abraham.
Yes, this is true.
So
this is true. And Jesus says he's not going to partake of the fruit of the vine until he returns. So implying that he did and will again. So
yeah.
So God eats. But that's a really weird thought.
Well, okay. let's just imagine you design the universe.
Okay.
With no needs.
Okay.
Like, you have no needs. The universe has needs, but you don't. But you get to design this stuff, but you can do whatever you want. You might as well eat.
It's one of the more fun things we get to do as human beings.
Right.
I
mean, we can't, I don't think there's anything that says God can't eat, and I'm sure he probably enjoys what he eats.
I think he likes chicken because everything tastes like chicken.
Well, yeah, that's fair.
The randomness that is us.
So, sorry for that little sidetrack. I don't know what was happening there, but yeah, so back to Gideon. You'd give all these other things the ability to eat, but not do it yourself. That to me, I'm sorry.
Right. I do
can't let
think
this go.
God enjoys certain things. And, I think relationally, we do see that in the Bible, that he enjoys having a relationship, which it's kind of interesting. A little trivia here. Eating is one of the few biological needs that we do in community.
Right.
And so we actually...
Like on purpose.
On purpose, right. Exactly.
And we have to breathe.
Yes. But as far as like something we choose to do and include others in meeting this biological need, it's not just something we do like with a partner or our close family. It's very much something that we can enjoy with a stranger. Yeah. This is how a stranger might become a friend. And it's through this shared need that we have. And so I can see God kind of partaking in that, not because he needs to, but because he wants to be a part of that community.
Yeah.
And maybe that's the reason why when we talk about communion, that's so important that it is eating and drinking.
Yeah,
and so
I can see that.
Just randomness, because we didn't plan on going down this little rabbit trail. But
hey, let's start the show. All right. So when we last left Gideon,
so he's had this encounter with God. God and Gideon have had this great conversation where Gideon is the teenager and God's being dad. And like I said, I love that. And God embodied has left the scene, but Gideon's still going to talk to God. We're going to have God's voice leading him. And God has consumed, like Nathan said, this huge meal, a goat and 25 pounds of flour worth of bread. However many loaves that would.
It's not keto friendly.
Not at all. And so, which tells you that keto's of the devil. But anyway.
Oh my goodness.
And since I'm doing keto, I can attest to this. So anyway.
That might be a little too much insight, but let's go.
Oh, yeah. Well, everybody's, it's kind of like CrossFit. If you do it, you've got to talk about it. So anyway, so Gideon, now he built this altar, which is, this is pretty standard Old Testament event. If God shows up, you build an altar, you build a stone memorial of some sort to commemorate the fact that God has appeared at this place. But this also creates a problem because we have two altars in this area, and you cannot have two altars in the same area. So one of them has to go. And this is when God commands Gideon to destroy the altar of Baal. Now, this command is unique to Gideon because none of the other judges are commanded to destroy the places of worship of the other gods. And it's interesting that this is his first, his first divine commission. It really is. It's not to build the army. It's not to assemble the troops. Unlike everybody we've seen before, it is to destroy this place of worship for Baal. Now, Gideon's name actually means hacker. And so he's going to hack down the Asherah pole.
I didn't realize that.
Yeah. And that's because we don't think about his name. We go with Mighty Man of Valor. And that's what most people want to associate with him.
Yeah. No, I do like that even still here you have him still being afraid. And he says, I'm too scared for my family, so I'm going to do it, but later.
Yeah.
Like at night when no one can see me. Let's do that.
Yeah. And so, he's not, God's just said he's going to be with him. And we know that Gideon knows the story of the Exodus. We know that he's heard about the miracles that happened coming out of Egypt because he's referenced them in his own speech to God. So Gideon has some knowledge of what it means for God to be with someone, but he's still a little hesitant. Now, what I do think is very interesting is that we have this Agadah in the rabbinic writings, and it talks about Abraham going and destroying the idols of the father. And that story that is told about Abraham, which, not part of the Bible, this is folklore.
Rabbinic, yeah.
Yeah. This story draws directly from Gideon's actions here.
Okay.
So the fact that the rabbis picked up Gideon's story and imposed it in Abraham's life kind of tells you a little bit about what they think of Abraham, because they were trying to answer the question, why did God choose Abraham?
Right.
And God didn't call Abraham until he's like 75 years old.
Right.
And so they're trying to fill in some of the blanks. And what happened before God sent him on this quest? Why was Abraham worthy of being called by God? And part of the reason why they choose this story of Gideon is because when you look at the stories of Abraham and Gideon together, you begin Abraham's story. He set out on a journey with his father. Mm-hmm. The Gideon's story is getting ready to be all about Gideon and his father. Angels come to visit Gideon. They come to visit Abraham. Abraham's at the Oaks of Mamre.
Mm-hmm.
Abraham's at the Oaks of Mamre. Gideon's at the Oaks of Ophrah. He prepares a meal for Abraham and Gideon. Both prepare meals for God that consist of bread and meat.
Mm-hmm.
Try to get my words here. Abraham argues with God. Gideon argues with God. The argument with Abraham results in the destruction of Sodom. The argument with Gideon results in the destruction of this place of worship for Baal. Sodom, obviously, we know about the sexual immorality that happened there. Mm-hmm. When we're talking about a place of worship for Baal, we're talking a place of sexual religious rites occurring.
Right.
So you have these very close ties between the lives of both men. So it kind of makes sense that they would actually choose a story from Gideon's life to kind of fill in those blanks.
Yeah. So that's cool. Now, one of the things that I like about this is just how much this little scene, there's so much personality in this. Mm-hmm. Because they find out who it is. They find out it was Gideon who broke it down, and the men of the town are mad. The Israelite men are upset by this.
Yes.
And they ask around and they find out, it was Gideon, the son of Joash. And so they go to Joash and they're like, give us your son.
Right.
And Joash, like you said, he was a pagan priest at this point. He kind of does a 180.
He does. And we're going to get into that, but you skip some stuff.
But no, I mean, I'm just talking about here's what I get from this reading of this text is there's so much personality in it, because one, you have Joash doing this 180, but you also have him going, well, if Baal's so great, it's like, okay, he's like, what's funny is he was like, all right, so immediately you have this where he's like, well, if Baal's so great, he can take care of himself.
Right.
He's going to say, we were worshiping him, but I'm not going to fight
Right.
for him.
Yeah.
And I guess, we'll do the other rituals, but we're not going to fight for him.
Mhm.
And so, to me, that's funny. And then when they change Gideon's name,
Mhm.
and I know, you probably have something on that, but when Gideon's name is changed, it's just, his name is like making fun of this other god.
Yeah.
And so I think that's brilliant. But I'm sorry, go
No,
on with what you were going to talk about. But I'm just saying, like, if you look at just the basic reading, there's just so much going on in that little bit of space.
This is what I love about the whole Gideon story. It is there's so much humanity in it, even more so than I think we see in a lot of other biblical books and stories about the biblical characters. You just really see him as a person. And when the rabbis did take this story and they imposed it back on Abraham, we have this kind of interesting interesting encounter with his dad,
Mhm.
where his dad, because for those of you who don't know the story, Abraham is supposed to have gone in and destroyed these idols that his father had, and he puts a stick in the hand of the biggest idol. And his dad goes, who did this? And Abraham's like, well, it was obviously the biggest idol. And his dad's like, it's just a chunk of wood. It couldn't do this. It was powerless to do this.
Mhm.
So it couldn't be that. And Abraham's like, then why are you worshiping him?
Sure.
So you still have this idea of gods being able to defend themselves. If they can't defend themselves, then they aren't worthy of being worshipped. And the writers just present the same idea in a different way. But when Gideon goes to do this, he takes 2 bulls and he tears down the altars and he cuts down an Asherah pole. He builds a new altar and he uses the Asherah pole to build the fire.
Mhm.
And he sacrifices the second bull. So we've got a lot of elements on the board here that we're playing with. Now,
Yeah. And I'm going to use your toys to do it.
exactly. That's exactly what's going on. Now, the first bull that Gideon takes, this is a draft animal. It's identified as an ox.
Mhm.
And now, when you have a draft animal and they're being used to work and, they've got a yoke on their shoulders, they've got poles rubbing against them, they're blemished.
Sure.
You can't use them for a sacrifice. And when you can't use something for a sacrifice, when you're going to sacrifice something to God, it can't be blemished. That's what I'm trying to say. And so this is the reason why he has to take 2. And the bull he takes, the second one is 7 years old. It's not a draft animal. And the fact that it's 7 years old and it hasn't been eaten yet, this is significant. Because, remember, they're in a time of starvation.
Right.
Food is something of a premium right now. So this tells you that this animal is, he's probably used for breeding purposes. He's probably a well-blooded animal, a high-quality animal. But there's also, he was probably used in the worship of Baal.
Okay.
And so he, how do I have my notes messed up?
I don't even want to know, but go ahead.
Yeah. Well, yeah. If we have to explain that thought to you, you aren't old enough.
Mhm.
So, before we talk a little bit more about that, because I do have some passages, I want to stop and look at the Asherah pole, because the Asherah pole, we've talked about Asarte before, and we talked about Anath. Asherah is a distinct deity.
Okay.
She is the wife of El, not Baal, but El.
Right.
And El is the father of Baal. And she's actually considered to be the mother of all 70 of the Ugaritic gods and goddesses. She's often said to be the nurse of kings and pharaohs, and she was had a lot of the same qualities as Asarte and Anath. So we have kind of some overlap in different places, because these gods did tend to be very intermixed, and they would merge and divide at strange times. So it's not always a straight linear shot to kind of follow their development.
Right.
So now what we do know about her is that she is closely associated with Tyre and Sidon.
Okay. And what do we need to know about Tyre and Sidon?
Well, Ezekiel 28, that's when we start talking about Satan, and we know that the Israelites were worshiping the goddess of the Sidonians. That's in 1 Kings 11:5.
Okay.
So she keeps showing back up throughout the Bible. And I think in a previous episode, I said exactly how many times. I didn't put it in here. She's mentioned.
And even after Judges, I mean, we still see her into Elijah and Elisha.
Yes.
And confronting her in lots of places.
We see her show up so much in the Bible that there's actually, and I'm not agreeing with this, and I'm not promoting this idea, that people have said that possibly the worship of Asherah was okay because she was Yahweh's spouse.
Right. That is an idea that existed, but apparently the evidence for that is so slim that they're thinking it was just like such a small.
These were people in rebellion.
Of Israelites.
Yeah, they were people in rebellion against what the Torah has said. So yes, even though people may have done it, it may have been just a handful. It really doesn't matter how many it was, because the point is it wasn't supposed to be done, and God had clearly said it was not supposed to be done.
Yeah, I think you might have made mention of his wife. Most people that I know are married. They at some point will mention their wives,
right? And if they don't, they're scum, and you need to walk away. So speaking as a woman. So now, and we know that she was very popular. She shows up in the Amarna letters. The Amorite king Abdu Ashirta, his name literally translates to slave of Asherah. Okay. So very popular at the time of Elijah, under Ahab and Jezebel. She actually, Jezebel's from Sidon.
Right.
So it makes sense that this is part of her worship. And Ezekiel addresses the problem of Asherah worship at the time of exile over and over again. And remember, we've talked about Judges probably was written around the time of Manasseh, king of Judah. And he's the whole reason we have an exile.
Right.
And so, matter of fact, 2 Kings 24:3 says, "Surely this came upon Judah at the command of the Lord to remove them out of his sight for the sins of Manasseh, according to all that he had done." So if we back up to 2 Kings 21, verses 1 through 9, I'm not going to read all of those verses. It tells us what he did. He rebuilt the high places of Baal. Mm-hmm. He made Asherah poles. He worshipped all the host of heaven. He burned his sons as offerings, and he dealt with mediums and necromancers. So
this was not something he did by accident.
No.
Is what you're trying to say.
Yeah, he did. This was direct defiance. And verse 7 of that, this is 2 Kings 21, verse 7 says, "And he carried the image of Asherah that he had made,
Mm-hmm.
He set in the house of the Lord, which the Lord said to David and Solomon, in this house and in Jerusalem, which I have chosen out of all of Israel, I will put my name forever." So he's putting the Asherah pole in the temple. And this is what leads to exile. And this is the reason why Judges is considered to be a prophetic book to that age, saying, This is what God did before when you messed up this bad.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're going to act like this, then you don't have a king. And we're going to take a king out of the equation completely. And you're going to be oppressed by outsiders, just like you were during the days of the Judges.
Yep.
So we need to remember that. Now, the people of Judges, they already had their prophetic word. They already, in Deuteronomy 16, 21, and 22, God tells them, don't plant an Asherah pole. Don't do it.
Right.
And Deuteronomy 17, 1 through 7, he talks about the kind of sacrifices you should bring. And there should be no worshiping of other gods, the sun, moon, or host of heaven. And if you hear of anyone doing this, you should investigate, attain 2 witnesses that can confirm, and then purge the evil from your midst.
Right.
So God, there's no mercy for someone who violates his word and commands on these things.
Right. Well, and especially when you figure, when you look at the rituals of worship, like I said, it's not an accidental thing. You didn't I accidentally walked into a meeting of people and yeah.
Now,
it doesn't
all of a sudden,
I'm
worshiping Baal. Yeah. Now there's,
and I think, and because I do have people I sometimes talk about, oh, well, I just got distracted and got so focused and started worshiping myself. And,
Mhm.
I realize, we can get distracted and we can forget to spend every moment thinking about God. But that
Right.
doesn't necessarily mean we're accidentally worshiping ourselves.
Right.
And so, yeah.
And and when you consider this in the divine council worldview, then it becomes an act of war.
Mm-hmm.
The very act of just changing your allegiance and who you're worshiping. This isn't just, oh, I think I'm going to be a Methodist this week and a Presbyterian next week. This is, this is huge. This is defiance.
Yeah.
And it's deliberate defiance. So verse 26, and build an altar to the Lord your God on top of the stronghold there. And so God is calling this place of worship, this high place, a stronghold.
Mm-hmm.
And this get military connotations. So we're back to that war idea. As a matter of fact, in Psalms 31, it means fortress is how it's typically translated. That's Psalms 31:3. In Psalms 52:7, refuge is another way. We have it in Daniel as fortress. We have it in Isaiah as strongholds. But the whole idea, it's military. It's used in wartime.
Yeah.
So if God sends someone to destroy the strongholds of his enemies, they're not going to stand. And they're going to be destroyed. This is because God's with Gideon. So now, because the rabbis, we could talk about them some, they read this story and they're like, there's problems. There's major problems with this whole account. And they list 8 problems. And
that's a surprisingly small number.
It is really for rabbinic discussion.
Go ahead.
Because, and I encourage people, if you've never read anything out of the Talmud, just find something online, read a section of it, just if
you're near a university, go to their library.
Yeah.
You'll find, like, we're in Oklahoma, and even in the middle of Oklahoma where there's not a large Jewish population, their Judaic studies section is so cool. Yeah, they've got 3 different copies of the Talmud.
I think one of them needs to come live at my house, but yeah. So
and they're very pretty.
But just to get that flavor and the feel for how they interact, and it shed some light on why Jesus talked to the disciples the way he did sometimes, and how normal that kind of was. But so back to Gideon, and the 8 problems that they list is 1. He didn't slaughter at the temple courtyards.
Well, there was no temple.
That's a problem. 2, sacrifices it was made at night. So that's...
Yeah, you don't do them. You don't do them at night. Okay.
No. Gideon isn't a priest.
Okay.
He did not use sacred vessels.
Okay.
He used the vessels of Asherah.
Okay.
He used the Asherah pole to build his fire.
Mm-hmm.
He set up a private altar, and the animal he used, they said, had been worshipped as an idol.
Okay.
So this is one of the things that the Talmud is really good at: space-time dilation, kind of warping of the timeline. The timeline's not necessarily something you use; it's something you overcome.
Okay.
And so this is another reason.
Because, there was stuff for the tabernacle, but where's that all packed up?
That's at Shiloh.
Okay.
So
not in the right place.
Mm-mm.
So there's 9.
Yeah.
Well, I guess, of course, the temple, I don't know. Of course.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that was like, I don't know.
Well,
there's a lot of stuff there. Go ahead.
No, and that's it, because there is no temple. And in Deuteronomy 12, we know that there's a provision made that once you're in the land of Canaan, you don't have to sacrifice animals at the temple anymore. You can actually sacrifice in a field. Now, there's a procedure, and I'm not going to go into that,
Okay.
but it tells you how to do it. Private altars were still allowed because there wasn't a temple yet.
Right. There wasn't the altar.
Precisely. Gideon's not a priest, but neither is Samuel. And Samuel offers sacrifices to God in Kings, or in the book of Samuel, sorry, not Kings. It seems like the restriction for priests only doing sacrifices really doesn't come into play until we do get that temple.
Right.
So, and then the sacred vessels until the temple, once again, I mean, you don't really have the sacred, you've got some of the sacred vessels in the tabernacle, but it's nowhere nearly established or elaborate
Right.
as it becomes with the temple. The Talmudic discussion, what we have to remember with them, they aren't about trying to record what was happening or replay what was happening in the text so much as to help the people of their own particular time follow Torah.
Right.
So they wanted to bring out the problems with what Gideon was doing to remind people in their day, don't do these things.
Okay.
Don't make these mistakes. So they're willing to kind of sacrifice Gideon's image and reputation a little bit if it's going to strengthen their own people's ability to follow Torah.
Okay.
And they didn't see it so much as a problem because in their mind, the Torah is eternal.
Mm-hmm.
So Adam even had the Torah.
Right.
And so their solution for this is that Gideon was operating under a special dispensation of grace, if you will, that God made a provision for him that was particular to a time of war when he was unable to access everything that would have been normal for someone during the temple, the times of the temple.
Well, and it goes back to if it's for saving lives.
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
yeah,
you can suspend as much of it as you need to, and God was trying to save his people from the oppression. So,
and this is what's going on here now. What I did find interesting is that second bull, when they recognized that as being worshipped as an idol,
mm-hmm.
They actually brought in something into the discussion. It's Leviticus chapter 1, verse 2. God says, "Speak to the people of Israel and say to them, when any one of you brings an offering to the Lord, you shall bring your offering of livestock from the herd and from the flock." And they said that the reason why God was commanding them to go to their own herds and their own flocks, not the marketplace, not the local stockyard, go to your own herd and flock, get the creature that you were going to sacrifice and bring it back, because this is going to ensure that the animal had never been worshipped as a god,
right?
That it had never been dedicated to be sacrificed for a god. It hadn't been used in bestiality. It had never been used as payment for a prostitute. And then they went into this full discussion of what constitutes a prostitute, which was kind of interesting. And that it had never been given to a woman by her husband so that he could have sex with her while she was menstruating. And so this is...
so many details.
Right? But that's what makes it fascinating, because when they pulled this verse in and they began discussing why this was a problem, that Gideon offered this bull, at first it kind of seemed almost superfluous to the text. And I'm
right.
kind of like going, okay, he offered a bull, but I didn't see it as a problem. Okay. But I'm not viewing this as a Jewish person would have, either during the rabbinic ages or even as someone in Gideon's time.
Yeah.
And so they claimed that 7 years where it was set aside was because it was worshipped as a god. And they're suggesting that the only reason why the text includes that number 7 was to give you that information, that if you would have been alive during that time, you would have gotten that.
Okay.
And because there doesn't really seem to be a good reason to include that little bit of information, because there's really not any kind of time or age limit set on the animals for sacrifice in the Bible. Sometimes they'll say bring a young animal, but it doesn't really give a specific number. Now, I couldn't find any external evidence for that. But I do think I think they were onto something, because if you take the story in totality and you look at all the little details that were given about Gideon tearing down this place, we're talking about a full reversal.
Yeah.
Everything in this account is a complete 180 from where it began. Baal's altar is pulled down. God's altar is raised up. Asherah was consumed by fire. God's glorified in her being consumed by fire. The bull owned by the owner of the high place now becomes used to worship the one true God. So
yeah, well, it's kind of like I said earlier. It's like we're gonna take over this, and we're gonna use your toys to do it.
Precisely. Like, yeah, you're just way more concise.
I mean, really, it is. I mean, it's just God saying, it's It's God saying, not only am I going to do this, but the stuff you meant for evil, I'm going to use for good.
Well, and reversal is such a huge theme throughout the entire Bible.
Mhm.
And so it makes sense that when God commands Gideon to do this, that, I mean, this isn't just winning. I mean, this is salt in the wound kind of winning.
Oh, yeah. Insult to injury.
It's, parading his enemies. That we read that passage a few weeks ago, and I can't remember it now. But he's putting them to open shame.
Oh, yeah. And there was a great N.T. Wright video. I have to see if we can link to it, if I can find it, where he was talking about, in ancient times, you would parade the people that you had captured before your people. You go off to war and you come back with this, and this is what parades. This is how parades started. I thought they were about floats and bubbles and tossing candy to crowds. Every time I always think of Drop Dead Gorgeous when I think of modern parades and the flaming swan float. Anyway, parades. They began as the king and his warriors would go off to another village. They would capture the people and the king. They would parade everyone through town and then kill the king in front of everyone.
Speaking of which,
do you have something on that?
We're going to go there, actually.
N.T. Wright was talking about this, how Jesus and the cross, that was the enemy thinking.
Right.
They were parading him in front of his people and killing him.
Yes.
But really what Jesus was doing was conquering them, and I don't remember if he said this exactly or if this was just a thought that occurred to me, but when you think about it, who all had to be there during that time? I mean, you imagine all the forces that were thinking they were winning over God at this point. Jesus is leading them through their own procession right up to and including death itself.
Wow.
And I mean, think about it. That's just chilling. I mean, when you think of all these forces, Jesus is leading them through town, unbeknownst to themselves, and they're slaying him. But at the end, he's actually in that process. They're offing themselves. I mean,
it's brilliant.
And it's just, you think about it, it just boggles the mind. I mean, I'll see if I can find that video.
Yeah.
It was amazing. So go ahead.
We need to put that, because that's good information to have. And again, it's bringing, it's bringing the divine counsel worldview back into the Bible and seeing that supernatural aspect of this, where it's not just a story about a man. And so, and even all of this is not just a story about a man. So, okay, we're in verse 27, and we've got some information, a lot of information packed in this verse. Gideon takes 10 servants. So if he takes 10 of his servants, that tells you by the wording he had more. His father owned the land where Baal was being worshipped. His father is the one who owns the oak tree. His father had the 2 bulls. His father was able to stop the men from killing him. And so all of this points to a few things about his family. Number one, they're rich.
Right.
According to this society and time, they are absolutely rich.
By their standard. And here's something else it tells you about them. I mean, even though you have him being a priest, being a priest for Baal, you still have the decency to take care of the servants. Because by rights, I mean, if food's scarce, he could have just released them and said, you're on your own.
Right.
But he's still taking care of them enough that they're willing to stay, right, and not try to run away, and willing to follow Gideon through this. So that tells you something also about there's that much decency to take care of the obligations of the servants. Yeah,
because I mean, and for them to join Gideon in this act was really putting their own heads on the chopping block. It could have endangered them beyond just a little inconvenience.
Right.
And it tells you that but it also tells you that his family's very influential. And I mean, anybody who can stop a mob with a single proclamation, that's somebody who's got some significant power.
Mhm.
And so that tells you about Gideon's standing, his family standing in the community. And it's going to play into what happens later on in his story. So as we move in to the next passage, Gideon gets found out because the people begin to demand, where did this go? What happened? Who destroyed this?
Yeah, I mean, because it was an altar for worship. Surely it was not just, I mean, it took time to build. It took resources.
It took time to build. This was the gathering place. I mean, this is where they got together to drink, have sex. I mean, you hang out with your buddies. All of these things happened. And people, when you take that from a community, people go into a tizzy. And it's really interesting because when I was reading this spring in Oklahoma, we had a ton of flooding. And there is this bar that's below the dam. And so it's called the Dam Bar.
Right.
And so it got just washed away. And it was amazing how that place, and I think, a lot of Christians would consider that a sinful place of den of iniquity, whatever. But the community, the people who showed up to help clean up the site, to rebuild, and in just a matter of a few months, they've built something that's like 4 times the size that it was before. And it's looking pretty impressive from the outside, actually. I may have to go check it. Yeah. And so, but
cleaner kitchen.
Right. And so but that's what community does. And they rally around these places. It's not just a place of worship for these people. It's not like they went like we go to church. You go take your place in the pew and then you do whatever you're going to do, and then you leave.
Shuffle out.
Yeah. This really was central to their entire lifestyle. So yeah, they're absolutely upset, but it also, this strengthens our tie back to that story of Abraham, because when the angels go into Sodom, they demand, give us these men. And Lot makes this feeble attempt to dissuade them. That's the word I'm looking for. And so the fact that Joash is able to actually just give this word, it's huge. And you kind of wonder, as the head of the household, how responsible is he for Gideon? I mean, there is a lot of responsibility as the father automatically, but how old is Gideon?
Right.
Because if he's able to stand against them, but they weren't coming for him, they were coming for his son. So that kind of gives you some idea that Gideon's enough of a man that he was seen as responsible for his own actions, but not so much that daddy doesn't step in.
Right.
So, and it is kind of an interesting twist too, that these idolaters are calling for Gideon to be killed when the Torah demands that it's the idolaters who be killed. So you have this perversion of the law that's going on there. So like you brought up earlier, Joash, he says, basically, if Baal can't defend himself, then we just need to step off.
Well, and what's the phrase? What's that phrase? Who is it? You see, there's you said one of your friends is the truth will stand when the world's on fire kind of thing.
That's Mammy.
Mammy, yeah.
Yeah.
And it's kind of that same parallel. It's if we're supposed to worship Baal, if Baal's the true God, he doesn't need us. And who was it? Spurgeon that Luke quoted on it during the interview with defending the Bible is like defending a lion. You simply let it out of the cage and it defends itself. It's all kind of playing on that same kind of theme that in the end we cannot escape what's true.
Right.
And so, and you see that also, as I was listening to, I think I was listening to Leighton Flowers, and he was talking about, when you realize your position is becoming indefensible, that's when you get mad.
Right.
And so if you aren't mad about your, if you don't get mad and defensive about your position, then it's more likely that it's true. And
Right.
so that's kind of what I see here with him going, hey, if Baal's in charge, tell him to take care of my son.
Well, and this is kind of, echoed with Elijah at Carmel with the prophets of Baal. It's can Baal actually show up? Can he actually follow through? My God can.
Yeah.
And so we see that there, but we also see it. I thought the other interesting place was Acts 5:33 through 42. And this is whenever the apostles are before the Jews, and they go before Gamaliel and say, hey, this is a problem. And he tells the people, says, he cites two other uprisings within Judaism where there was a claim of the Messiah being there. And he says, nothing happened with them. But if it is from God, then we aren't going to be able to stop it.
Sure.
And you don't want to be opposing God. So he, again, good rabbi, he goes back to this Old Testament passage and says, here's the principle, and this is how we apply it. So even though he doesn't directly cite it, he uses the same logic. And he would have known the story. He probably would have known the story about Abraham and the idols. He was pulling off of this rabbinic wisdom that he had. And he was considered, he was a pretty smart dude. He was actually the head of the Sanhedrin at one point. So, and then of course we see what Paul produced, and Paul being his student.
Right.
Yeah. So
we should maybe do some study on that at some point. I would like to dig into that a little bit.
It's interesting because it gives you that connection back to Judaism, and it gives you that connection back to a historical construct. Matter of fact, he was so highly thought of in the rabbinic circles that I've actually got this quote here. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, which if you do any rabbinic study, you're going to learn
find
his name.
Yep.
He says when Gamaliel died, when he died, the honor of the Torah ceased, and the purity and piety became extinct. So that's how highly revered this man was.
Wow.
So and that's huge.
It's a high compliment.
Precisely, especially coming from Yochanan ben Zakkai. So
right.
But this is very much his father's making a theological statement. He's saying any God who needs protection isn't a God worth worshiping.
Right.
And now, going back to what you were saying about that parade, this is just one tie-in with what you were saying there. Consider the cross in the light of that. The fact that Jesus did not need human protection.
Right.
That tells you all you need to know about his divinity. And
I hadn't considered that. I mean, well, I kind of have, but I hadn't put it in those exact words.
Oh yeah. And this whole story does tie in, because when you go to John 2:18 through 21, and the Jews say, what sign do you show us for doing these things? And Jesus says, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. And he was talking about his body. And so I'm paraphrasing here greatly, but therefore he was raised from the dead, and his disciples remembered what he had said. So the resurrection was the sign. Not only could he not be destroyed by the hands of man, but he was able to overcome those who came against him. 1 Corinthians 15, Paul discusses the significance of the resurrection. And I'm bringing this up because so often as Christians, modern Christians, we want to talk about the resurrection metaphorically. We want to, Jesus didn't really go through that. That was just to teach us some kind of spiritual lesson. If you do not affirm the bodily, real, factual resurrection of Jesus Christ, everything else about our faith is meaningless.
Right.
And so,
yeah. Well, and I know he's not real popular with the Christians anymore, but Rob Bell did have a great quote on that when somebody asked him about whether or not he believed in the resurrection. And this is, and you can take this in two different directions. Now, I think he said it in a way that kind of gets him off the hook for believing in the physical resurrection. But he said, was it something happened 2,000 years ago,
right,
in Israel that changed the course of human history, and And when I think of that, I'm thinking it must have been the power of God, right?
Right.
Because again, there's lots of evidence, and we could get into the evidence for the resurrection. I think that might actually be kind of a fun episode to do at some point. But it really is. I mean, like I said, if you don't believe in the physical resurrection, Paul said, to quote Paul, basically our faith is useless.
Yeah. Well, I think, Ephesians 1, and I'm just going to read this whole thing because it is so powerful, and especially in the light of this, and to see that this idea was so much a part of Judaism. It's part of the Old Testament ideology about the power of God. So Ephesians 1:19 through 23 says, "What is the immeasurable greatness of his power towards us who believes according to the working of his great might that he worked in Christ when he raised him from the dead and seated him at his right hand in heavenly places, far above all rule and authority and power and dominion and above every name that is named, not only in his age, but also in the one to come. And he put all things under his feet and gave him as head over all things to the church, which is his body, and the fullness of him who fill in all. So this is Jesus' death and resurrection, as you were saying so much with the parade illustration. This is an act of war. And not only is it an act of war, it's the winning act of war. And so the idea that Jews had no idea who Jesus was, or had no way of comprehending who he was at that time, the Old Testament shows you that God had been setting this up from the beginning.
Well, and back to, and it also it echoes that reversal theme too, because you didn't get put on a cross just for no reason,
right?
And it's and the cross, again, it was a symbol of defeat. If you were on the cross, that meant you lost the war,
right?
And Jesus is saying, no, I didn't actually. So that's, I don't know, it really is amazing when you get to thinking about it. And again, and this is actually, I love it whenever we get to talk. I love going through the Old Testament stuff. I really do. It's so rich, but to me, it gets exciting whenever we get to see how it crosses over with Christ.
Well,
and how it all supports that. And so
yeah, well, and then when Gideon is renamed, because here's the other really fun little bit of this: when he's reborn, to get a new name is to say your essence has so completely changed. Because remember, we talked about this several times. The name reflects the essence of the person, and so Gideon's name, the one who contends with Baal, he's got a totally new identity, and not only does he have a new identity, his new persona, his new identity is now he's a walking, talking reminder of the impotence of Baal. And nobody who comes in contact with him can forget Baal lost to Yahweh.
Yeah.
And so when you put that in context with the resurrection.
Well, and not even, yeah. Well, sorry, I'm sorry, was there more to that thought?
No, that's
but not even that. I mean, I love this. It's Baal lost to a servant of Yahweh.
Right.
I mean, it goes, Baal lost to a person.
Yeah.
We didn't even need to bring God into this necessarily, right?
Yeah, this wasn't an angel. This wasn't God himself. This was the low man on the totem pole. So I think that's.
And Gideon goes into that resume. It's like, I'm the least of my tribe. I'm the last person in the least of the smallest tribe of the tiniest house in the section of the.
And I don't even want to do it.
Yeah, and on top of that, I don't feel like it. Yeah.
Right. And God still wins. So
yeah, it's brilliant.
So I love these ideas, and I think this is where the Bible comes alive, is when we start reading it this way. So the Midianites and the Amalekites, we're now in verse 32 and 35. The Midianites and the Amalekites, and we've talked about the Amalekites before and who they are. They gather up for their annual raid. Now, it's interesting that the Midianites have partnered with the Amalekites because the Amalekites are bad guys. We just don't want anything to do with them. They're part of the Rephaim, the descendants.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
So I think we talked about that in the Deborah episode some.
Mm-hmm.
So, but in this, we find that Gideon's clothed in the Lord. Now, that's an important phrase that we're going to come back to, that he's clothed in the Lord.
Okay. Because that is a weird phrase.
It is a weird phrase, but oh my goodness, the writer of this account is so brilliant. I mean, just like as far as writing, just the literary tools he uses.
Right.
And so we're going to see that, but we got to get through the setup to see how he's doing this. So they're gathering up for their annual raid. God tells Gideon, hey, you're going to take an army out. And this is where the fleece incident comes in.
Mm-hmm.
So this is 36 through 40. I think most of us know it. He lays it out one night and the fleece is wet and the ground is dry.
Mm-hmm.
The second night, he reverses it and the ground is wet and the fleece is dry. And I think for us, one of the things that comes from this is, despite the fact he's clothed in the Lord, or has the Holy Spirit, if you want to bring New Testament terminology to it, he's still very human.
Right.
He still has his doubts. And I think sometimes we expect Christians who have had an experience with God not to have their doubts. And so I kind of found this encouraging.
Yeah.
That you can have this kind of encounter with God and still have your doubts, and God's still going to use you.
Right. Plus, we get a fun little phrase out of it.
Right.
Nice little shorthand. So.
Some more little Christianese. Yeah. So, yeah. But Gideon knows to, at the same time, he knows what he's doing is wrong. He actually uses the phrase, please don't be angry. Is what he ask God. Please don't be angry that I'm seeking this.
Mm-hmm.
And in Genesis 18:30, we have Abraham asking God not to be angry, it's reconnecting us with the Abraham story again. The difference is in that situation with Abraham, this is when he's arguing with God for Sodom. The 50 men, the 20 men,
mm-hmm.
and so on. God actually invited Abraham to have that conversation. And when we talked about that on one of our previous episodes, God's like, shouldn't I say something to my prophet? Isn't it right that he should know? I'm butchering this, but that's kind of the idea.
Yeah.
God isn't inviting Gideon to this conversation.
Right.
So, Gideon's kind of taking it on his own. But when he finally does just accept it and roll with it, and he sends that call out for the troops, 32,000 men respond.
That's a lot.
It tells you that he's somebody.
Yeah.
And it reaffirms everything we were saying about his father before.
Mm-hmm.
He has got some influence to pull 32,000 men. That's what, like the population of Muskogee?
No, I think it's a little bit bigger than that.
So, no, okay, something like that.
That's irrelevant. It's the population of many towns.
Right. So, now it's still not a huge army when you consider.
And also realize most people don't know how big Muskogee is.
Right. True.
Sorry.
I'm used to teaching in a college in Muskogee, so I like to use Muskogee as a reference point. But anyway, when you can remember the Midianites and the Amalekites, they have 135,000 soldiers. So still not great odds. But God tells Gideon, send home anyone who's afraid, which I think, man, to me, it's curious that when God says, send home anyone who's afraid, 22,000 of these guys go, yep, that's me.
Yeah. Well, that probably would have been me, to be honest.
But I guess, I don't know, because I know a lot of guys who would never, ever admit they were afraid, and they would just, I'm gritting my teeth. I'm going through it. I'm gonna make it happen.
Yeah.
So, but for 22,000, so now he's down basically a third of what he had.
Third.
Yeah,
it's down to 10.
Down to 10,000, and and the whole purpose of this obviously is to show that God's going to win the battle, not Gideon.
Right. And
so then we have this really weird incident with the guys drinking at the stream.
Yeah.
It's just so bizarre. I don't think It's
Did you find any good information on it?
No, I didn't.
And not anything reliable, huh?
Not anything. No, it's like God's like, what's the most ridiculous test I can come up with? And this is what he decides. And, it just shows us that our ways are not God's ways. I mean,
well, it is. But it's funny to me because you said the most ridiculous test. And I'm like, for some reason, my mind went to like stupid human tricks from Dave Letterman.
Can you lick your elbow?
Yeah. And so, yeah, they're just.
Yeah. Okay, so for those who don't know what the test is, basically it takes them to the stream to drink. And some of them like kneel down and lap the water up like a dog.
Mm-hmm.
And then some will lift the water to their faces and with their hands cupped. And so the ones who lap the water like a dog, obviously they can't see what's going on around them.
Mm-hmm.
Where those with the cupped hands can see what's going on. And so Gideon keeps the ones with the cupped hands. Now, the question is, the only thing I found, and this is just a question that was thrown out there, is God keeping the smart ones, the ones who make the best warriors, because they're still able to pay attention to their surroundings? Or is he keeping the ones who are the most afraid, who were too afraid to just surrender themselves to the experience of putting their face in water?
Or I mean, you're also looking at they're in a time of oppression.
Mm-hmm.
Is he keeping the ones who still who still think of themselves as God's children and still think of themselves as human and not animals?
Oh, that's good.
I mean, that's a thought that I had. I mean,
yeah, that's actually, yeah, I like that.
Again, just a question because I don't know.
Yeah, the text doesn't actually spell that out, but yeah. No, that's a good question. But what this boils down to is Gideon's getting ready to march into an army of 135,000 Midianites and Amalekites with 300 men.
Mm-hmm.
Ridiculous.
Yeah, it's a crazy ratio.
Yeah, there's no time in history where this has really worked out well. We even have a movie about a 300-man army, and they all get slaughtered. So I mean,
if you wanted some perspective, but although I do, I'm guessing also too, some of the numbers are probably symbolic.
Mm-hmm.
We've talked a little bit about that, how that works out with ancient math and whatnot. But and I do wonder sometimes if body counts are a little bit skewed because you realize they're, a lot of times they're using swords. So, if you find like half of a person over here, find a torso here and legs over here, does that get counted twice sometimes? Or
I'm having the Lord of the Ring moment. It's 3, 4.
It still counts as one.
Yeah. Well, and these are questions I think unless you're there, you probably aren't going to get to find a good answer. Right. It's all going to be speculation. But the fun is in the speculating. I do enjoy that because that's where you begin to ask the questions that do make those connections between those Old and New Testament passages and the different stories. So
yeah, and again, we speculate a lot, but and we go on some crazy tangents. But I think at the end of the day, if you're winding up with God is sovereign,
right? God is good.
And those things, Christ is king. If you keep landing back there, I don't think you've stumbled on a completely wrong answer.
Yeah, and that ties into some more of Gideon's story, and because that's we're gonna find that that's where Gideon fails.
Okay,
and so the importance of continuing to worship God through these things. It's we don't have to have all the answers.
Right.
We just need to keep looking for them. And so, so God sends Gideon out against the Midianites, and we're in verses 9 through 15. But before that, Gideon, he's still scared. He's still having a problem. And do
you think maybe he was like going, send anyone who's afraid? It's like, can I get on that?
Right. That's me.
Am I exempted from that? How does this fill out the right paperwork? I don't know.
Oh, if I would have known you were going to pick the guys who drink like that, I would have been among them.
Now you tell me.
Right. Well, and what I love here in this story, and I think it kind of gets another one of those points that gets overlooked. I can't remember hearing this in Sunday school, but God actually sends Gideon into the Midian camp, and specifically to strengthen his hands, which means to give him courage.
Mm-hmm.
And so, God knows Gideon's still afraid, and he kind of preemptively, before Gideon can go, okay, God, I've got another fleece. We need. He says, I'm going to do what it takes to embolden him. And evidently, Gideon, even though he's popular among the Israelites, he's still anonymous enough among the Midianites that he can slip into this camp without being recognized. And the description,
because he hasn't done anything to provoke their army yet.
Right.
He's just basically ticked off his own people.
Exactly. And that's the thing. He's kind of flying under the radar. And in this portion, when we talk about the Midian army, there's some key terms. They're like, the soldiers are like locusts. The camels are without number.
Mm-hmm.
They're with like the sands of the sea. So, seeing these things, this is what I found to be very interesting. Seeing these things should have made him more afraid.
That's exactly what I was thinking.
But what he hears is what makes him bold.
Okay.
And so now, faith comes by hearing, and
so
we got a connection there. And what he hears is a Midianite soldier he's talking about a dream, and in this dream, this barley cake tumbles. I love the word there. It tumbles into camp and smashes a tent, and it causes the tent to go upside down and left lying flat. And another soldier offers an interpretation of the dream, and this is verse 14. And he says, this is the sword of Gideon. Gideon's going to be the one who comes and conquers. And God has given our camp and our army into Gideon's hand. Now, this is such a weird dream, but what we got to remember is this is a people who were used to thinking abstractly.
Mm-hmm.
Language was not as developed as it is now. That's such a weird concept for us to begin to wrap our minds around.
Right.
Hebrew is 4,000 to 6,000 words, depending on who's counting and where they divide them up and all of that. English is over 100,000 words. Easily, it's growing every day.
Yeah.
So they understood the ability to think abstractly and to kind of glean as many meanings from a single phrase as possible.
Yeah.
So a barley cake was the offering that's made on the second day of Passover.
Okay.
And it's among the first fruits offering. Barley is harvested before wheat.
And this is he's hearing this in the Midianite camp.
Well, it's not. He's not given all of the connections of what barley cake would mean for Gideon, but he does know the barley cake dream. He heard that in the Midianite camp.
Okay.
So he heard the dream itself, and he heard that the interpretation is that the cake is Gideon.
Okay.
So Gideon would have known that this was a Passover offering, that this was a first fruits offering.
Mm-hmm.
These are things he would have filled in from his own experience.
Gotcha. Okay.
As a reader, it's reminding us what this battle is about. This battle is about bread. It's about crops. It's about feeding his people.
Mm-hmm.
And because the Midianites, they aren't just stealing from the people, they're stealing from God.
Right.
And so God's not going to let this stand. And one of the things I found interesting was the fact that we have this Midianite, an outsider, who's having a dream that conveys a truth from God. And when we talk about outsiders receiving truth from God, we typically do find it in this dream form. We have it with Pharaoh and Joseph. We have it with Abimelech and Abraham, Nebuchadnezzar and Daniel. So this is typically how God is communicating with people outside of the covenant community. And so I thought that was very interesting that, again, we find it here in Judges.
Yeah.
So, but what I thought was so great about this story, once again, seeing should have just terrified him.
Yeah.
But his faith was strengthened by what he heard. And it's interesting to me, too, that he'd been hearing from God. And it wasn't God's voice that reassured him. It's actually the voice of the enemy. And so this might foreshadow some problems with Gideon, that he's more willing to listen to the voice of the enemy than God himself.
Okay.
But at the same time, what it does reaffirm the idea that God is God over everyone in all the world and can speak to everyone. And so the idea of these territorial gods and God being above them that would be heartening to hear.
Yeah.
So, and this is really the moment of transformation when we go from Gideon being that scared little guy in the wine press in the middle of the night to the mighty man of valor.
Yeah.
This is the moment where he changes and he steps into that role.
Okay.
So,
well, cool.
I'm getting signals.
I think that's a good place to end it for this week. I'm still wrapping my mind around a lot of that.
Yeah.
Because there's a lot there, and I do. I mean, we have a couple minutes. I mean, we can chat, but because I'm thinking about that because you're talking about God using the dream. The dream was to the enemy soldier,
right?
And so, yeah, that's interesting because you do have this. He's using symbols that Gideon would have understood. And I think I'm probably just repeating a lot of what you said, but he's using symbols that Gideon would have understood to be like, no, I'm already in the camp.
Yeah.
Is basically what's saying.
And he can speak to anyone. He doesn't have to speak to just the Israelites. He can speak to a Midianite because he's that big.
Mm-hmm.
And, we go back to the idea of territorial gods again. This is where God's power shines through for these people. The idea that God exceeds anything territory-wise. He's not associated with a single place or just a single people group. He can be greater.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what makes him worthy of worship. Every God that everybody else was familiar with was limited in power next to Yahweh.
Well, and I mean, and you kind of, if you want to take that even to kind of a modern kind of, I don't know, it's not necessarily application, but a modern view is we see God using these same symbols to speak to the world in movies and in literature. It's all the same stuff. It's what we do on the commentarians.
Right.
Is we look at how God is speaking to people, even though they may not get the message. We're getting the message.
Well,
that's
well, and if you look at even the symbolism of bread, I mean, we go into the New Testament. What Jesus says, "I'm the bread of life." Bread is so central, and so it's something that is given by God, and it's something that we also give back to God. It's part of the sacrificial system. You begin to see that this life-giving item, it really is central in Judaism as far as what it means about God's presence. And so for God to say in this dream that Gideon is a barley cake, that he is this piece of bread, he really is elevating Gideon as something that is life-giving.
Yeah.
And so, as believers, that needs to be something we strive to be. Are we life-giving? And so we have the bread of life within us, and we should be passing that forward. So,
well, cool. I like that. Well, on that, I think we should go on ahead and let everyone know if they want to be part of the conversation. Hit us up over at ravencreeksc.com or on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at ravencreeksc is where you can find us. Also, sorry, the screen flashed on the camera computer. I was a little worried for a moment.
Right.
So, yeah, join us there. Be part of the conversation. If you would like to support us, there's a support link over at ravencreeksc.com. Feel free to click on that if you want to pass us a couple bucks to keep the show going.
Buy a t-shirt, a coffee mug.
Buy a t-shirt, coffee mug, as featured not so prominently here. But yes, we look forward to hearing from you. If you want to support us but don't want to actually hand us cash, we like that too. Be sure to share the episode, hit subscribe, rate us on iTunes. All that stuff helps us out. And we want to just say thank you for joining us, and thanks for being encouraging and keeping us going. And we will see you next week. Thanks. Bye.
Bye.
You've been listening to the Faith and Other Oddities podcast, a Raven Creek Social Club production. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. If you like what you've heard, please write us a review on iTunes or consider supporting us on patreon.com/RavenCreekSC. As always, thank you for listening, and don't forget to join us next week.